Good morning. We look today at Matthew 24, verses 1 through 28. And here's when Jesus comes out of the temple, it says, and he was going away, and his disciples comment to him on the splendor of the temple. It says here in Matthew, the disciples point out the buildings of the temple. In a couple of other Gospels, they are marveling at the magnificence of the temple, and here it's the buildings of the temple. So it's they're looking at this, and it's kind of the awe, and I think of seeing the Great Pyramids and stuff. I mean, how did they get built? And the great stones that were moved in and put in, and the opulence of the temple was so much more than the normal person's house or anything like that. It was they spared no expense or no effort, and so the disciples pointed them out, and Jesus says, "You see all these, don't you? But I tell you, not one stone will be left. They're all going to be thrown down." And they didn't understand that this temple that was it looked like it was indestructible. But yet it was totally destroyed in 80, 70, almost 70, somewhere in there by the Romans. And it just didn't seem possible to these disciples that such huge stones that the way it was built, it just didn't make sense that it could ever be destroyed. And we kind of get that feeling sometimes too, that this something is going to last forever. But yet then all of a sudden something happens and things change. But Jesus wasn't, I think, only talking about the temple, but he was talking about himself too. I mean, because he knows what's going to go on, and he talks to the disciples about the temple being destroyed, and then it says the next part he was sitting on the Mount of Olives. His disciples come to him privately and ask him, when is this going to happen? When is going to be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And we're familiar with this passage, and with when you hear of wars and rumors of wars and this and that, and false prophets come, and many will be led astray, and but for the disciples, and I can totally understand why they didn't understand it, why they didn't get it, And so often, we kind of wonder, well, why don't they understand? But yet the same thing today, happens. I mean, there are things that, that are facts, but yet other people will say that just couldn't have happened. And, and you can have eyewitness proof, and, they won't believe it. But, the disciples weren't a bunch of simpletons. They were common, ordinary people. Didn't mean they didn't, figure stuff out. But again, Jesus spoke often in kind of parables, or in, sometimes what he said seems like a riddle to us. It could mean this, it could mean that. And it's like what he says, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Don't be alarmed, that must take place, but the end is not yet near. And so often, people will look at all of the wars we've had. You think about the last, it's 2023, the last 100 years would not even include World War I. But, there's just continual conflict. There's continual stuff going on in the world. And we can look at that and all of the political unrest and everything that's going on and say, well, certainly the end must be now. But if you look back in the 1500s or the 1600s or the 1800s, people could say the same thing. So it's when, Jesus says the end is not yet. So, it could end tomorrow. I'm not saying it couldn't. But we can't look at today and say, definitely the world is going to end on such and such a date. And, that's happened many times. And, the majority of those dates are past. They're in history. That day has come and gone, and the end has not happened. It's just like, in the end of the 20th century, what's going to happen? All the computers are going to, nothing's going to work. Well, we went through that day, and if there were glitches, there were very few. But So it's, we look at this, and we look at, and Jesus in verse 12 or 15 refers to, the prophet Daniel is brought up. And if you look back, there's 3 places in Daniel where it talks about the sacrilege of the temple and the offerings in the temple and the different things in the temple that are being desecrated by pagans, by non-believers, and it talks about that's the time that the people of God must flee. Jesus talks about that, verse 12, there will be an increase of lawlessness. The love of many will grow cold. People are going to fall away from following Jesus, and this happens continually throughout history. And I mean, how many people in today's world were maybe brought up Christian, going to church and Sunday school and learning about God, and have decided as their adults, nah, no such thing, So, I mean, we still have people turning away from God. And so, I mean, we can look at all of this and we can be saddened by it, and we should be. But Jesus is saying you can't determine that the end of time is going to be now. When we get to the very end of this reading for today, Jesus talks about, when the second coming does happen. Somebody says Jesus is going to be in Minneapolis tomorrow. No, he won't. If they say that Jesus is in wherever, don't go. I mean, Jesus says when it happens, everybody will know. You're not going to have to run and find me, because you will know. It'll be a universal happening. And verse 28, the last verse we look at today, is a strange verse, and Mark, I think it's Mark's gospel. It's the same words, I believe. No, in Luke, I'm sorry. But wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. And you think about that. What's a vulture? I mean, a vulture feeds on dead meat, death and destruction, and it brought to mind the picture of these 2 frail old men sitting on a bench talking, and the vulture sitting there watching them, just waiting. And it's the vultures probably aren't going to cause that death to come, but they're waiting for it. They're watching. They're waiting in the wings for anything that can happen. And they're going to, something happens or doesn't happen, and they're going to say, see, that didn't happen, And so, they're sitting there ready to pick things apart when something doesn't happen. So if we look at some of the prophecy, Jesus says to the disciples, some of you will not die before you will see this. This generation will not pass away. Well, I mean, everybody that was living when Jesus was on earth is dead. There is no question about that. So people could look at that and say, well, see here, I mean, it didn't happen, so it's not going to happen. And, they're waiting to pick things apart. They're waiting to point fingers at everything. And it's just, when there's conflict in our churches, which there is. I mean, not everybody has the same opinion. Not everybody wants to have worship at 9 o'clock or 9:15 or 10:45 or well, that's just not convenient. That's not going to work. I mean, we have vultures sitting watching us all the time, and we have so many people in the world that are looking at not only the Christian religion, but the Jewish religion, the Mormon religion. There are, how many religions are there in the world? I think at one point in time I read that the United States military forces recognize like 236 different religions, not denominations, but religions. I mean, how can that be? But yet people are watching. These vultures are sitting there watching. And when something doesn't happen, or if something happens that, is a conflict, they're sitting there pointing out, that must not be a God, must not be love, that, humans are just picking at each other, anything and everything. These vultures people sit in the wings are waiting to pick apart those who believe. And it makes, and when I first read that verse, I remember reading it many different times, and but then when you stop and think about it, there are people that just thrive on other people's misfortune. And I think that that's a little bit of what Jesus is talking about, that we need to be unified, that we need to be working together, and know that when God does send Jesus for that second return, that we will be ready. And we can't let anything distract us or take us away from that, as these vultures, they would just love to do.